So Kevin has chronicled the persecution against WikiLeaks and Assange for more than a decade, and he was one of the few journalists to travel to Fort Meade and report on the military court-martial against Chelsea Manning. His newsletter at thedissenter.org, which is a project of Shadowproof, which he co-founded, covers whistleblowers, secrecy, and related press freedom issues. It also provides updates on the latest in the U.S. prosecution against Assange. Kevin has appeared on The Nation, Salon, Common Dreams, and Truth Out, and it has been a featured guest on Democracy Now!, The Chris Hedges Report, Counterspin, and Al Jazeera's English, The Listening Post. And I might also say on Project Censored Radio. Oh, yes. I'm editing your bio. And I am also here in that capacity with Project Censored because the book was released as part of a collaboration between Kevin and the Censored Press and 7 Stories. So please check out projectcensored.org because we operate on the principles of freedom of the press, free speech, combating censorship, and the promotion of media literacy. And so, Kevin, I want to start out here with something that you mentioned a few times in the book. And I feel like we should all keep this in the back of our minds as we have this conversation tonight. In the United States, there is no law against publishing classified information. No law against publishing classified information. So I just want to let that be an overarching thing that we keep in mind. And I want to start off with talking about the CIA here, which I hate talking about, but because you talk about this in the book, and in fact, there's an entire chapter about this, and how they're a main driver of the prosecution against Assange. And in the book, you write about how after the Vault 7 documents were published, quote, the gloves came off at the CIA. And of course, the CIA is not known for having gloves on at any point anyway. Pompeo in particular was rabid in his attacks against WikiLeaks and Assange. And there were a couple of points in the book that made me definitely do a double take. One that Pompeo and others at the CIA had created a, quote, carve-out for WikiLeaks that amounted to, quote, treating WikiLeaks as a rival spy service, meaning that they could mount offensive counterintelligence operations free of any oversight, end quote. And then because this apparently worried some people with half a brain at the National Security Service who thought that outright killing or kidnapping Assange would not be legal. So they tried to, for instance, John Eisenberg, a top lawyer for the National Security Council, allegedly, quote, urged Justice Department officials to accelerate their drafting of charges against Assange in case the CIA's rendition plans moved forward, end quote. So, Kevin, starting off with this, how big of a role does the CIA really play in this egregious case against Assange that we see playing out now?
Thank you for that. So I think with the limited reporting that we have, it's very clear that the charges that are on the table against Assange would be different if it weren't for what the CIA had done. I'm not going to sit here and claim that there wouldn't be a political case brought against Julian Assange. I don't think we can truly say that given the vindictiveness of the US government. But what we can say is that at some point, the Justice Department was afraid of what the CIA was going to do to Julian Assange in the Ecuador embassy, or once they got him removed from the Ecuador embassy, and they decided we should get this above board, we should file charges, and we should approach this as if it looks like we actually care about the rule of law, which we know that's highly, highly questionable, and they don't care about the rule of law. When you look at what WikiLeaks has revealed, and you just go through a whole range of issues that have been exposed thanks to documents published by WikiLeaks, but also if you just look at the actions of the US government, you can go before 20 years ago, but I think when you think about WikiLeaks, what they exposed really reveals what President George W. Bush's administration was doing in their lawless activities, what lawless activities were unfolding under President Barack Obama, and in particular, when we're talking about the surveillance apparatus of the United States. So, I mean, that's a good way to begin to get into the issue of the CIA. But I just want to pause for a moment, and though it's a little disjointed, something sticks out from the introduction that we had here for this event. And it's this idea that there's a lot of people in these spaces right now who are engaged with political issues who may not know anything about Julian Assange. And I just want to say that I think that there are a lot of different factors for that. They, believe it or not, conducted a poll. It was at least a year now. There was an agency called Morning Consult that went around, and I was surprised to see that there was any sort of interest in trying to uncover the attitudes of people. But they found that there was quite a difference between Australia and the United Kingdom and Germany and some other European countries where you've seen some engagement, and then the United States. And they found that people in Australia really do want to see Julian Assange brought home, and that makes sense. He's one of theirs. He's an Australian citizen. They're really engaged, and they've had a breakthrough, and they, at the moment, have a prime minister who will represent to the United States that the case should be brought to an end and Julian Assange should be allowed to be freed. But when you think about the United States, this poll found that around half of people from the US who were asked this question about Julian Assange had no idea who he was. And so that has always stuck with me. And then it's also stuck with me that there are people who organize politically, who are part of, I guess for lack of a better word, left movements, and that they're not doing anything. And I'm not here to start fights. I actually really support this group that I'm going to name here, but the people who put on the Socialism Conference every year in Chicago, where I'm based, I got together with a couple people and pitched them a panel discussion on Julian Assange, connecting it to the FBI, talking about civil liberties, and wanted to get in and share some of the things in my book and engage with them on some of these left issues, theoretical issues, bring Julian Assange into that space and try to get it into being part of the conversation. And they decided that there wasn't a place for it in the conference this year, which is a little disappointing to me because I really do like it. It's one of the better conferences that I've regularly attended. And it's also right where I live. And so for at least the last 10 years, I've made a point, as long as I didn't have a conflict, to go there and support them as a journalist, but also to attend as somebody who's interested in these topics, whether they be abolition or climate, environment, organizing, labor organizing especially. And so I just throw that out there so we can take the temperature of what's going on. I think that there are people who should be engaged in this topic and considering it that are not really that engaged. And, I think you could also approach this question of why don't people know who Julian Assange is in the same way you might approach other political prisoners. So like if you said, why don't people know Mumia Abu-Jamal? Well, you could start to run down the different issues as to like why people don't know that individual. Same with like, why don't people know Leonard Peltier or Lenny Peltier? You would go, okay, well, I know. And and so then for Julian Assange, you say, why don't people know who Julian Assange is? And if you work your way backwards, as we probably will do in this conversation, you start to get to why there isn't more people out there demanding his removal. And it isn't an accident. And I'm not trying to let people off the hook who know better, who could be part of the calls to action to free him. But I also think that it's not an accident that we sit here today with a great engaged group here, but people aren't fighting to get in through the doors so that they can hear what's going on with Julian Assange and is he going to be extradited to the United States or not? Even though right now we are in the most precarious moment of the case when he could be extradited at any moment. And that is what the court is about to decide. This UK appeals court in London is about to decide whether to make the final decision that could mean that Julian Assange is being put on a plane and will be showing up in Alexandria, Virginia for a hearing that, mind you, should be as newsworthy and as big of a spectacle. And I call it a spectacle not because of Julian Assange, but because of what the Justice Department will be doing. It will be as much of a scene as any of the arraignment hearings in the Trump cases so far, because and as it should be, because it will be the beginning of no return when it comes to the dismantling of our First Amendment.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for highlighting that. And I agree with you. I think it's absurd that there aren't more people engaged about it. And when I talk to people, for instance, in organizing circles that I'm a part of, either people are like, that kind of rings a bell, or somebody will say something like, well, didn't he do this? Or isn't he also an asshole? And I know it's a little nepotism, but I'm going to quote Lee Camp here, who was talking about how people would talk about Snowden like, well, didn't he drop out of college? And it's like, what does it matter? It's like if your house is on fire and someone says, hey man, your house is on fire. And then you look at your house, it's on fire, but then you turn back and be like, didn't you drop out of college? Like, your house is still on fire. Like, it doesn't matter whether you would want to go have a beer with Julian Assange. That is not the issue here. And so I think that that's also the point that needs to be addressed, because I think a lot of people fall into this trap of, well, I heard propaganda about him saying this or him doing that. And it's like, it doesn't matter. And I kind of want to get to this aspect of Assange as a person, not because it's important to the case against him, but because he won't be allowed to use any of that, like the motivation aspect here, why he chose to start WikiLeaks, why he chose to so-called open governments. Because motivation is really a key aspect of the law that we have in the United States. You know, it differentiates first-degree to second-degree murder. Like, did you mean to kill this person? Was it premeditated? And yet, you highlight in your book that when it comes to whistleblowers and when it comes to the court that Assange will be in, intention won't matter. And in fact, you write that in the book, in the case against Daniel Hale, who is currently still in prison, how the government in its prosecution noted that, quote, any attempt to inject a necessity, whistleblower, or similar motive for the defendant's conduct is irrelevant, end quote. Furthermore, prosecutors claimed that the Espionage Act did not require the government to prove that Hale, quote, intended to harm the U.S., end quote, which I don't know how you can be a spy if you don't know that you're a spy, if you're not intending to be a spy. But so can you talk about that motivation aspect and how you're basically saying, well, Assange, you can't have any kind of defense in your trial because it doesn't matter what you meant to do. It doesn't even matter if you intended to harm the U.S. It just matters what we believe.
I may be getting ahead of you just a little bit, but I think it's important to note in addressing your question that Julian Assange is not a U.S. citizen. So that makes the application of this Espionage Act even more alarming and disturbing than these prior cases. Some of them that are known, some of them are extremely well known, and I go through each of them in as much as it's important and relates to Julian Assange. And so when you think about the Espionage Act, the way that it is argued in court right now, I mean, like, a lot of people are going to learn about the Espionage Act through Donald Trump's case, which isn't actually terrible, but it's bizarre because it's not, his case is totally different from any of these other cases that we're talking about as it relates to Julian Assange, because the model has been to go after whistleblowers and silence them with the Espionage Act. And so when you think about this, what they have done is made it impossible for somebody, like you were naming Daniel Hale. And Daniel Hale is right now in a communications management unit in a prison in Illinois, a federal prison, in a special housing unit called a communications management unit that was established by President George W. Bush's Bureau of Prisons after the September 11th attacks to control the communications of people who were accused of terrorism. And they are very harshly confining him and using this in a way that is despicable. And he released information about the drone program, basically revealing that somewhere on the order of like 80 to 90% of people who were being attacked were civilians. And the people who pilot these drones that are in the US Air Force know that that is the civilian death toll from the drone aircraft. Now, that was at the height of drone warfare when Barack Obama was president. And so he ended up pleading guilty because he knew that he couldn't enter into a courtroom and tell the judge, this is why I did what I did. And he pled guilty in the same way that Chelsea Manning pled guilty to some lesser offenses so that he could then make a statement to the judge and say why he did what he did. So that might be available to Julian Assange if he wants to. Once he gets brought over here, he could plead guilty, and then he could tell a judge, this is why I published documents. But yes, people need to understand that the way that this is structured, if it's applied much as the same way it's been applied to whistleblowers, then if you can't stand in court and say why you blew the whistle, you can't stand in court and say why you practice journalism. Like, that sounds absurd. You can't stand up in a courtroom and say, yeah, that's when I got these documents and I had these sources and I worked with all these media publications. We took care of this information because we thought yada, yada. Well, so then I have to, I'm sorry, I'm going in all different directions, but then I have to bring in the issue of the fact that I got tongue-tied. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. Well, I was also going to say with the intention aspect that they've already used intention against him when he can't speak. So the Crown Prosecution Service, for instance, you mentioned in your book, took the position that WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange was not comparable to the New York Times, suggesting that his intention was to get people to break the law. So you're accusing people of having an intention, but then they can't say what their intention was. Yeah. I mean, that's absolutely absurd. So, did you catch up on your tongue tie, or should we move on?
No, I was going to work in one of these details about how, like the fact that he is not a U.S. citizen and the fact that he never had a security clearance is one that people don't immediately think about when they think of this persecution. But what I meant to say before I got totally lost in my train of thought, which probably means that you were all lost, so I'm sorry for that. But when you are working for the military, or you're working for the National Security Agency like Edward Snowden, or you're working in the Central Intelligence Agency, you have to get a security clearance so that you can have access to that information. And then you sign a non-disclosure agreement, which is very different from where we are when we talk about Julian Assange and intent to violate certain laws and all sorts of regulations, because he never signed any document. He never sat down for any kind of a polygraph exam or anything to figure out, are you loyal to the US government or are you not? Have you or have you ever? None of those questions were ever put to Julian Assange to get access to these documents. He just got them the way that journalists always get information and have for decades. And I think that when it comes to WikiLeaks, what I remember when I was covering this as they were published in 2010 and 2011 is people were stunned by the volume of information that was coming out. We were talking about 700,000 documents or more that were shared by Chelsea Manning to WikiLeaks that were submitted, and it gave people an immediate idea. Everyone has to remember this was a formidable case when it came to internet news gathering, basically, because people saw you could have a submission system where you took a bunch of documents and you sent them over to a website very quickly. And then now they have them all. And if they have any integrity, they could choose, like WikiLeaks, to let you in on their source material. So most news organizations, when they get documents, they choose to just report on them. And you never, as the public, get to read any of the documents that they have available. WikiLeaks said, let's come up with this thing that we'll call scientific journalism, where we'll partner with media organizations. They will have a first attempt to report on anything in the documents, but then we're going to post all the documents to our archive, and it'll be there as a historical record forever so that people can use them. And historians and other people have actually written books that have referenced the WikiLeaks documents. And also, it's worth noting that the Washington Post and the New York Times and some other publications in reporting on U.S. foreign policy often goes into the database of U.S. State Department cables to find things like there's a lot in there that relates to the war in Ukraine right now. There's a lot in there that related to the coup in Bolivia and latest developments in Brazil and different parts of Latin America. People I recall have used those documents. So Julian Assange never signed anything. He never agreed to keep anything secret, but he's being punished for disclosing this information.
Yeah, it's absurd. And again, in the US, there is no law against publishing classified information. And so...
And if I could just add, that's because President Bill Clinton vetoed a law on his way out of office. So there was a chance that the government could get on that side, and that didn't happen. And in fact, at the same time, he pardoned a guy named Samuel Morrison, who was one of the earliest Espionage Act prosecutions, and came like after Daniel Ellsberg.
Wow. Well, and all of this is in the book, by the way, so you don't have to remember all of it or even take notes. So I want to get into the U.S. citizen aspect because, as you write in the book, all the charges against Assange represent, quote, an extraterritorial application of U.S. laws, end quote, which in and of itself is a big deal. But there seems to be this like push-pull, right? So Pompeo, vis-a-vis the CIA, said, and you quote him in your book, that Assange, quote, has no First Amendment freedoms because he's not a U.S. citizen. Well, then riddle me this, Pompeo. How can you apply U.S. law to him if he has no access to the U.S. Constitution? And then furthermore, in 2018, a New York judge ruled that Assange and WikiLeaks could not be held liable for publishing information that Russian agents were accused of stealing, noting that, quote, if WikiLeaks could be held liable for publishing documents concerning the DNC's political, financial, and voter engagement strategies simply because the DNC labels them as secret, then so could any newspaper or media outlet. Ding, 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 ding. But that would impermissibly elevate a purely private privacy interest to override the First Amendment interest in the publication of matters of the highest public concern, end quote. So there's already been a judge who said this is a First Amendment violation, but then Pompeo says he doesn't have a right to the First Amendment, but then he shouldn't have a right to be tried under U.S. law. I mean, this is a cluster. Can you outline a little bit how incredibly messed up this is and what kind of precedents this sets with regards to those points?
But we need to talk about Mike Pompeo. And we first need to breathe a sigh of relief that he's not running for president in 2024. But not that he would have beaten Donald Trump anyways, as we're seeing. But that's a tangent. We won't go on. But Mike Pompeo has been very aggressive and belligerent against Julian Assange. His memoir, which failed miserably when it came to selling, it contains a few words in it that basically says that Julian Assange raped America basically when he published the documents, which I think is completely ridiculous language to be printing and inflammatory. And I don't see how you could get a fair trial when an official is writing stuff like that in a book that people have available to read. That being said, he gave, in his first speech as CIA director, he singled out WikiLeaks as a hostile, non-state intelligence service. And he called it a hostile entity deliberately for the purposes of being able to get away with what you were talking about in the beginning here, of being able to target it with a disruption campaign. And we know this because in one of the few rare examples of a media organization trying to dig into and figure out what this US government has been doing against WikiLeaks, some reporters at Yahoo News, including Michael Isikoff, who became a distinguished journalist by covering warrantless wiretapping. Thomas Tam was at the Justice Department. He was a whistleblower. He did a story based on his persecution and helped him actually avoid being charged under the Espionage Act. But then Isikoff went on to do a lot of Trump-Russia stories like the major prestige media journalists have been doing. But then he went on to disown a lot of it. And then eventually he wound up doing some great reporting here. And that's what you've been hearing referenced here tonight. Uncovering this disruption campaign, talking to over 30 former officials in the Trump administration, in presumably parts of the CIA or the National Security Council, staff members, mid-level people who were willing to talk. And he was able to uncover all the craziness that was going on behind closed doors, talking about plans to kidnap or kill, potentially poison. I know they talked about how when he was in the Ecuador embassy, they could leave the door open maybe. That way some police could come in and snatch Julian Assange and take him out of the embassy. So they're talking about violating the norms or the protections that are supposed to be afforded to a diplomatic building on UK soil. And so they talked about potentially poisoning him, as I said. And that to me just seems like the CIA going back to its roots, because that's what they were doing with Patrice Lumumba in Congo. They had this whole thing where they were conjuring up this toothpaste that they could give him so that he would be assassinated. That's eventually what happened, and their fingerprints are all over his death. But, that's why I think we really need to be paying attention to people like Pompeo. And Pompeo talks about stealing secrets. And so did Michael Hayden. And there was an actual documentary that was called We Steal Secrets about WikiLeaks. But the person, I must tell you, in that documentary who says that is Michael Hayden. And he's talking about the CIA and not WikiLeaks. And so the people who steal secrets are in the US government, not WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks obtains them legitimately, like journalists do, because they're in the public interest. And they go through the information and they publish it because those archives, 90 to 95% of the time, are going to be for us all to read and be beneficial to us to read. There's only really like a few morsels where like it was ever published and I went, I'm not really sure who's that for, but nobody should be prosecuted for it. But like, there's really no duds when it comes to WikiLeaks. A lot of the stuff that has been put up there has always been really worth digging into and understanding our knowledge about groups and different entities. There was Scientology that they exposed. There was all kinds of different documents that have been posted over the last 10, 15 years. And then the US government has successfully, in the last 3 to 4 years, made it scary for anyone to give any information to WikiLeaks because of what would happen to you. So they succeeded. And then, there were people who were giving documents to The Intercept, and you could argue that the government was also making it scary to give documents to The Intercept, much like they made it scary to give documents to WikiLeaks. So we see a pattern, and people like Mike Pompeo are behind that pattern. And then to go back to, and I can finish this part, really early part of your question, you were saying that a judge has already recognized that they should have a First Amendment right, but Mike Pompeo himself is saying Julian Assange does not have a First Amendment right. Well, here's the thing. I got this from James Goodall, who was the general counsel for the New York Times when the Pentagon Papers were being published. And he went into court and argued that Richard Nixon's administration shouldn't be allowed to block them from publishing those papers. Meanwhile, all these other newspapers, aside from the New York Times, were actually publishing the Pentagon Papers. So he told me that if you're prosecuted under the Espionage Act, that's a US law. So you should have all the due process rights that come with being prosecuted under a US law. What are those due process rights include? I think they include constitutional rights. They include things like not being cruelly put through cruel and unusual punishment, right? It includes the Fifth Amendment right to not incriminate yourself, not have to incriminate yourself. You have privacy rights, supposedly. Of course, we know those are always violated, and all you have to do is look south to the Navy base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, to see how easy it is for that to be violated, because those lawyers have not had any privacy when it comes to representing those terrorism detainees. But that being said, you're supposed to have due process rights when you're prosecuted under these U.S. laws, and those should be afforded to Julian Assange.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the New York Times and what you call prestige media, and I want to get into that too, because you talk about this in your book, that, quote, many of the headlines from establishment news media spread the DOJ's accusations of a, quote, hacking conspiracy. This was back 2010, without acknowledging the implications that the charge could have on freedom of the press, end quote. And since the beginning, it's clear that corporate media or prestige media has often taken the side of the prosecution against Assange. And you have, again, as I mentioned, you have an entire chapter about this, and as well as references. And I thought what was really great, too, in the book is that you have a list of instances going back to the 19th century when the media has published classified documents, which is, again, not illegal, for the good of the people, and thereby upholding the idea that a free press is necessarily an adversarial press. Could you give some examples and talk a little bit more about ways in which the corporate media has upheld this case against Assange, and also how they are, this really pisses me off, how they are indebted to WikiLeaks and Assange for using the information that they then refuse to support Assange in?
Yeah. So first, I just want to give credit to Carrie Shankman, who has another book on the history of the Espionage Act, and it's called A Century of Repression. And it's a book out from the University of Illinois Press, and he has a co-author, Ralph Engelman, and he worked on this book, and it's a deeper dive than what you get. I have one chapter on the Espionage Act, and then the rest of it is all story that is unique to Julian Assange and from whistleblower cases, etc. But to get the full picture of the intersection of the US government's repression of movements and groups and journalists, and how the Espionage Act has been deployed and how it hasn't been reformed, and the way Congress has tolerated its abuses, I really recommend that book for further reading. And he's the one who came up with the list of examples that I reference in the book of the different times that journalists have published classified documents in the past. And that was entered into evidence in the extradition hearing that unfolded in September 2020 in London, when they had this 1 month. A lot of the documentation and things that I refer to in the book come from that hearing. We had witnesses that came forward and testified, like Pentagon Papers whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg. Noam Chomsky entered a statement into the record. Patrick Coburn, this great journalist known for his Middle East reporting and reporting on Iraq particularly, he contributed a report. So there's just a lot of really good material that came out in defense of Assange to show you why it was wrong for the United States government to pursue this case. And as you're mentioning in my book, I have a chapter on the media. Now, you could do a whole book, and somebody should, and maybe it'll be me before this is all over, but a whole book could be done on media malpractice when it comes to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. I decided, rather than picking examples from the last 10 years and leaving some out, bringing some in, and people might ask me, why did you omit that? Why didn't you put that in here? Don't you remember this thing? Although I do think that the worst example, and I do mention this, is Bill Keller of the New York Times when he was executive editor, and he printed a column and he did this whole piece about Julian Assange where he basically called Julian Assange a bag lady and talked on and on about how he had like smelly socks and he was a weirdo and he stayed up all night. And basically Bill Keller just had a problem with him being a kind of hacker, and that was like he was living a certain nocturnal lifestyle that people from his ilk, for lack of a better word, live. And he tried to make that weird and icky so that people would hate Julian Assange. And he put out a lot of garbage. And to the credit of the great Daniel Ellsberg, that was one of the things he told me he most hated about Bill Keller before he passed or died back in June. So anyways, I did a whole chapter where I particularly highlight examples where the judge in the extradition case referenced the media or the prosecutors have referenced the news media. So for example, you have CNN publishing an article where they say that the Ecuador embassy was used as an election meddling outpost by Julian Assange with no evidence. Well, they had evidence. Actually, that evidence was documents that El País, the Spanish newspaper, obtained that unravel the fact that a private security company, and I'm sorry, I'm just getting to this now, but a private security company called UC Global was working on behalf of the CIA to target and spy on Julian Assange and Stella Assange and his attorneys and journalists and other visitors that were coming to the embassy. So they got those materials at El País, and they decided that their people who read them should know that an abuse of power was just committed or something that involves gross violations of privacy has just been committed. CNN got these files and they decided, how can this fit into Russiagate? Because that's what we're doing right now, and we got to find some way to make this fit our cable news narrative. And they tried to say that Julian Assange was, somehow using Ecuador embassy to help Donald Trump get elected president with no evidence whatsoever. And the judge referenced this as an example of, okay, this is why the CIA and other agencies had interest in Julian Assange. And so I'm not going to buy into this idea that he's been abused at any point. And this is also why he's being prosecuted and why he's of interest and why the US government wants to extradite him. So everything is okay. And there's a couple of other examples I can get into, but I'll if you read the book, you'll get those. But that's a good example of the kind of malpractice that we've seen, and it's filtered its way into the case to make it easier for the US government to prosecute Julian Assange.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think we'll open it up to questions here. I just wanted to make one point when we wrap up, because this quote has echoed in my mind since the day that I heard it, when I heard Edward Snowden talking about why he did what he did. And he said, "My greatest fear is that nothing will change." And so I think the weight of that quote sits on our shoulders. And I am so grateful that Kevin has written this book, because I think it is such a great call to action, this book, and sharing this information and getting this story out there is what we must do, so that in the words of Snowden, something does change, and so that we are not hanging these people out to dry in vain, and we can fight for their freedom and their ability to practice journalism and be whistleblowers. So thank you so much, Kevin, for this conversation.